Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Wow, the fourth wall is big. I feel like I need a roving mic. Can I use your roving mic? Can I use the roving mic? I can use three microphones, right? That sounds like a cool. And I'll put this on mute if I need it, because you're all the way over there and I can barely see you. Hi, this is not going to be stand-up comedy, I promise. Annie just introduced me. Thank you for having me, Annie. I feel kind of like really flattered to be in conversation with you all and as part of the series, because Annie's invited a bunch of really incredible speakers and thinkers and activists and artists for you to, and DJs and scholars who I really admire, who've been coming through this. So when I saw the series, I'm like, oh God, okay, this is my context. So I feel quite flat. And why do I say that? I'll maybe come back to this image in a bit. But hey, wait, how's this gonna work? Left, there we go. When I was making slides for today, I was just like pulling random slides from my other lectures I give at the Glasgow School of Art, teaching fine art critical studies and queer and trans stuff. And I was kind of thinking, because there's something about where I'm coming from as a person who makes creative stuff, right? That I've kind of always tried to resist this description of an artist, and it's something that I've kind of only started encountering as a description of what I do in my work in like the last 5 years. And that's partly because I'm a poet. And I kind of been trying to say, like, for me personally, like, poetry does something, there's a space in poetry, there's like a way of engaging with the creative material that we use, which is primarily language, be that in voice, be that on the page, be that spoken word, and how it relates to how we live, and I think, and like what our aptitude towards life is. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, probably at the beginning. And that feels a little bit different sometimes from, I think, the professionalization of the arts and what that means. And yeah, so I usually say I'm a poet who works in performance and sound as well, and partly because a lot of poets don't even think about how they're going to say the words that they've written down out loud. Some poets only really think about that. And between that, there's a huge gap, right? A huge space. And I'm also an activist scholar, which I think will kind of come up in some of the work that I'm talking about more recently. And so these are my two books that came out last year. That's why I was showing this to my students earlier in the year. And this book on the right, Trans Femme Futures, Abolitionist Ethics for Transfeminist Worlds. It's kind of like, it's a mix of things. It's kind of philosophy. It's kind of political critique about the state of trans organizing for around trans rights, but moreover trying to think about what trans liberation really might mean for us and how we look after each other and survive in this transphobic environment, and transphobic and hostile environment, racist, like ongoing colonial context that we live in, which is Britain. And so I spent most of last year talking about that. The book came out literally 51 weeks ago. So yeah, so this is like real Gemini problems, right? I'm basically, every day I wake up and I have to be one of these two people, either the person who wrote this book or the person who wrote that book. And most of the time I'm teaching in Glasgow, so that's me. So I kind of wanted to begin by talking about my entry points into this, and I feel like I'm going to go back actually, because I think there's something about politics is kind of the word in pink here. Because my relationship to writing and creativity does originally kind of come through music, and simultaneously there's also this question of like the things that happened to us politically in 2010, 2011 that kind of set me off on this different direction of work and of interest in what my writing has engaged with, and like basically becoming a kind of a political poet in certain ways. One of the key people who's responsible for this direction in my life for me is this guy, Sean Bonney. Today's the 6th anniversary of Sean's death in 2019. Sean was kind of, I want to say I don't want to call him a poet of the streets, but he was really just like a poet who's very present in kind of punk, subcultural, spaces, although those words don't really do it justice, kind of leftist spaces. He was also just kind of like a stalwart of the innovative poetry scene, just kind of like the experimental poetry world in London for nearly 15 years, from the beginning of the 2000s until he moved to Berlin. And his work kind of had this like deep political engagement with the world, with what's going on, with the transformations that are around us. And in that was also this sense of what for us was the political commitment of art or of poetry or of life or of whatever. And that we were figuring these things out in this kind of moment of the kind of like anti-austerity, anti-cuts kind of student movement that was really around from like 2010 to 2013. We spent a lot of time doing readings between like picket lines, in squatted and occupied spaces, in social centres, at demonstrations as well. And oh yeah, this is hilarious. This is some images from 2011. I mostly put these out for these guys at the front who are like, oh yeah, archive old images. This is a demonstration on March 2011. We occupied Oxford Street. We were reading our poems on Oxford Street. There's various poets who are pictured here, including Francis Crick, who's also a really great co-editor and was Sean's partner as well, amazing poet. And yeah, and this was really the test of like, where does our work exist, and how does it sound in that environment, in the world that it's in that place in the street, you know? So it became like, how does language, how does sound, how does poetry both operate in those spaces, and then simultaneously, how are those spaces also in dialogue and responding to what the work is doing? The work that's where the site of the engagement of our writing and our thinking and our creativity is. And that's not to say it was just exclusively in the street and in these demonstrations. And, you know, we spent hours and hours and months talking about, like, can poetry do anything politically? What's the political function of poetry? Which, this quote from Sean that I pulled out, which is actually from a prose text he wrote called Letter on Poetics, that kind of was a hinge and a real kind of, like, key text in his writing life. It's at the start of a book called... that's this book here, isn't it? I put it in the slides. Letters Against the Firmament is the one in the bottom right. And so it's really the questions of like, what is happening with lyric, what's happening with questions of the lyric I or the subject on the page. How is poetry breaking through the kinds of logics and grammars and like modes of thinking and of existing that are being kind of foisted onto us, I should say, in the kind of neoliberal consensus, which at this point was, you know, so when I say 2010, this is like the Conservative government was elected with this coalition government, and the first thing they did was raise student fees to £9,000 a year, which is like the legacy you guys are all sitting in, right? And to £6,000 to £9,000 a year. And in that is this transformation of education into a commodity, think about what it means to be a consumer of education rather than for it to be a space of study, or for a thing of study, a thing to learn for its own sake. And and next to that, I think like there are all these questions around, what is the efficacy of creativity and of poetry and of our arts, of the things that we make. Sean had this line in one of his poems where he's just like, the next day we made art, it changed nothing. And just a sense of like, not just being dismissive or defeatist or despairing about what the possibilities of creativity are, but to really like honestly and realistically face what our creative practices can do. What's the function of creativity in a leftist social movement, which is still like a huge question that's often ignored. And to know that, sometimes you can't use a poem to stop the riot police charging you when you're demonstrating in the street or when you're about to get arrested. But the poem can activate something in our thinking and tell us about what to do, and it can even guide our political action in a certain way. And in this sense, like, we're working out of what is kind of almost classically like Bolshevik socialist aesthetics from the like 1917 in a way, and like thinking about Brecht and stuff like this. And that's like the beginning of our legacy, of the point, right? So yeah, so here's all this. This hilarious images. I just wanted to pull this up because I always remember this image. And then in the process of that, I'm sipping my tea. There's like a second line of like, which is the like how I got to poetry angle. So this is story 2, and probably the more significant one, the one that I tell more, which is kind of through trans and queer community and activism and politics. I spent quite a lot of time as a present, and then as a community organizer in the trans scene and the queer scene in London from the middle of the 2000s to the middle of the 2010s, which is when I left to move to Scotland. And we were really thinking about, these questions of like, how do we write, or how do we make art? But really, poetry was actually kind of key. I knew there were some musicians. It was mostly poetry and musicians. Like Sian Lester was quite present in our lives at that point, or at least in my life, in the early 2010s. How can we make work that really is expressive of our existences as trans and queer folks, living in these like bodies that are like where we're like embracing indeterminacy and genderqueerness and non-binariness in some sense, and this is kind of early in the language of non-binary, kind of early 2010s. And how does that refusal of these forms of gender norms in our, literally in the everyday fabric of what we do and how we live and how we make relations with each other, how we live our lives, how we have sex, how come like poetry or art express that and capture something of the beauty and what often feels like this kind of like wildly, almost lyrical fantasy of existing in queer and trans life in this moment. This is like before gay marriage, before all that stuff. This image that I'm going to try, I work at an art school, so I'm always really conscious that I'm not talking about the images that I'm showing. I'm not describing them. So apologies, because that's also an access thing. But this image is it's an image by Della Grace Volcano, who's a very well-known queer, trans, intersex photographer, who's been making work since the 1980s. Della's still around. And it's of 2 punks, both who have undercuts, making out. You can see their tongues. And this was kind of like, this was like the aspiration, I'd say, for what we were trying to do with our work. This is actually the image of the cover of my book, Counter Sonnets. But I really wanted to show the image because like, this is kind of like what we're trying to get at in terms of like, how can we meet this in terms of creative expression? What happens next? Oh yeah. And so this is then what we're met with, right? Not Transgender Marxism, that comes later. I mean, I was doing my PhD, and I have a chapter in this book. That's why I put it there, writing about queer and trans social reproduction and care and collective care and histories of collective care. But basically, this is probably one of my favorite things I ever encountered in thinking about the relationship between sexuality and capitalism. It's a picture of the main branch of Buckley's Bank on Charing Cross Road, with a rainbow flag. And the hashtag Freedom2, which was the slogan of London Pride this year. I think it's 2014, it may be 2015. But it's like the year or two after gay marriage was legalized. And for us, this was like this, I always think I read this image as like the peak of the abstraction of the kind of appropriation of LGBT politics and life that capitalism has been trying to enact on us, right? That you can just be cash points with a badly painted rainbow flag. So that's like where we get to politically, and I was kind of writing about some of this stuff in this book, which I'm going to talk about some stuff from in a bit, which is Of Sirens, Body and Faultlines. Cool. Okay, so that's the past. I think that's it. Oh yeah, some other things that's going on. Oh, where's Mendoza? This is Mendoza. Another person who's kind of key in this thinking for me is this person who's a human made as a visual image, which is the poet Mendoza, aka Linus Slug, insect librarian. Mendoza's poetry is always thinking about voice, the construction of voice. They variously describe themselves as a Northumbrian poet, and they were using Northumbrian dialect, working class dialect, also Southwest London dialect, in their work constantly as artifice. And they invented this form called the niner, which I'm going to talk about more later. There's a conveniently written niner on the back of their book from, I think from 2014, from Contraband Books. And Mendoza and I we were like partners in crime. We are partners in crime. We were partners in crime for many years in this contemporary poetry space, really primarily like making zines. And I say that because, again, thinking about how our work is circulating, how it's being distributed, that it's a time where small press publishing is really the way that our work exists in the world and how we circulate it. So people producing editions as small as sometimes like 30, but sometimes way more, sometimes 81, multiples of 9. Thinking about zine culture as a space of like, here, I've created something, I can give it to you. You can just have it. We can have this unmediated relationship with what we've produced. And so Mendoza had a zine called Freaklung, which is an anagram of Garfunkel, as in Art Garfunkel, and I was kind of helping organize printings, this kind of stuff with Mendoza, who alas is not in the room with us, but they're around. And I guess I'm trying to think a little bit about some of the concerns, again, of like where the work's coming from or going to politically, or what I'm going to keep talking about as we continue. This is a poster for Rappapuck, aka Race and Poetry and Poetics in the UK, that Nisha and I co-organized with a gang of other academics back in, we have a steering group, but the first symposium we organized was in 2016. And kind of since then, we were also trying to bring, I'd say like develop a space for an academic conversation that's also engaged with readings and is a bit more open and is thinking critically about what's happening in relation to race and thinking about marginalization and like race and institutions too, in poetry, in this kind of innovative experimental space that we're situated within. Also frustrated with maybe a lack of serious critical interest in other forms of spoken word as well, and also trying to break down some of the divisions that exist / used to exist / sometimes continue to exist between like highbrow poetry on the page and spoken word poetry that only exists in the moment by people performing and being in front of you. Okay, so I've been talking for a bit. Where am I? How am I doing? So this is a useful, I got to talk, my talk isn't linear, which is also really useful for me and makes life complicated too. I might read a little bit. Should I read a bit? I'm looking at these guys in the front. And that's because I'm going to try and read, and I'm going to try and talk some more, and I think it will be helpful for context. Okay, I'm going to turn off this mic. Switch. Yeah. I need this one ultimately. Okay, but I'll stay here. What I'm going to do is, and this mic's nicely and quieter, I'm going to read a little bit from, I'm actually going to show you this slide. This makes more sense. I'm going to read a bit from this book, which is called Apparitions. I usually talk about the form of this work, but having just blabbered a lot, I'm maybe just going to briefly show you this. So we're thinking about the Mendoza, who you see here, is kind of the inventor of this form called the niner, which it's contemporary form. It's me reading what it says on the slide. Contemporary form of the 9-line poem, typically in sequences of 9 poems. More recently, the niner consists of lines of 9 syllables and or other numerical orderings in the number of sounds or words related to the number 9. And which this is like, this whole form is also like a kind of we think of it as like a punk or post-punk front to classical form in especially Anglophone poetry, which, like the iambic pentameter has been this like rule for many years. Sorry, I'm going to talk about poetry a lot. And in the space of this, other things start emerging in terms of what it means to try and produce, for me personally, in terms of like what it tries to mean to produce work sequentially, or for poetry to have for a poem to have an implicit order in how the text runs. And yeah, hopefully some other things will happen that we can then talk about more. So, So I'm going to read the very beginning of this book. I'm going to read the first 9 poems. I'm going to zoom in and make this bigger. I'm going to make a full screen up here. And it'll be fun because you can watch me make mistakes. That's how it goes. This of obscure cosmos, violence reiterated, vivid paused blood in fire and sin, aesthetics, silver and liquid, eyes stenciled brick, quote, as authors who could not conceive us and hold, to have lived impossible gravity, chilled and all known ways. I realize I need to use this microphone. Decima unmade and horny, our shaven flesh and locks dined on black beans, corn and sugar, vagabonds, trinkers, tricksters and jailbirds had demanded our bodies, fascist rags, codes and division, systematic flesh and capitals. Nostalgia imposed and derivative nations, soil. Agree. Your logic treacherous, political and philosophic, distribution of thought and activity engineered, divestment, hot policing and exotic. But some of us want to keep our jobs. In your demand that we flesh, nice for being and pills, had abolished your entitlements, our sexism flesh is constituted from the women and femmes who charged. You, pale and sweating majority, smears and intonations, assured arrogant thieves. If your violence a source of pleasure, we trust our anxious days and juts were once bridges, borders, decline, winter bones, gorgeous, warm. Girl, if we are citizens of nowhere, a threat to the tone and image composed, cute lace, we divine femmes know here to dissect your impositions. So late in the day, bark organs in casual violence, your pleasure, excruciate living, and the beauty about our eye lines. These decades-old violence for bored stars and black salt, she said the possible diminished, order administered names, heart and solstice-eyed, fall into the wage day, turbulent shimmer, out of discourse traded close, pinned, ordinary trappings and verse, to squat, dislocate. In nationhood, your reveries, 500 truncated years, we dined on stolen whiskey, tar, ministerial bones, forced to find work, a rustic allegory, narrating cities and aggressions, light and nature false, conditioned, cohered by skins, separated, crushed. At trial, your crimes of invention. In my charred gold mini dress, cremated homes, debt and circuits, capital commission and hate. Dined on flour, divine salt and threads of your flags, aroused. Our vulgar comedy, drives and erotics, silenced beliefs and rituals, disintegrating. We impossible siblings, lobes, sore close hairs and gleaming, our traumas dismissed, bitter salt stream in cheeks spark structurally. Your lavish, sheerest divisions, devaluations, institute, ions, blood, harmonics, of work, migration and conjugal flicker, track memory. Stars and being and pills. She says had your impositions. 500 truncated years. We impossible siblings, homes, debt and circuits. Our shaven flesh and locks dined on. Smears and intonations. Cool. Magic. I'm not going to be able to turn this back on. That's okay. Oh, it's on. Great. Okay, cool. So that's me reading the first bit of Apparitions. More to return to. Here we are. Let's go back to this. So in this, so Apparitions, so I've been talking quite a lot about stuff from the early 2010s in terms of things that were things were influencing my political thinking. I started writing this. I'll just talk about this book really quickly and then talk about some of what's happening for me on the page and in the moments of performance. So this is obviously, I've been talking about politics, and I've been talking a little bit about trying to create a poetics that is expressive, that is that articulates some of the minutiae and I don't want to just say nuances, but complexities, the forms of marginal living that accrue for many of us trying to survive. Survive's not just the word, but survive and live, survive and thrive. In relation to queer and transness, in relation to economic precarity, in relation to Black and brown life and its marginalizations economically and socially and politically. And this text I started writing this text on two things. It's 6 months after the Grenfell Tower fire, which I'll talk about some stuff later that pertains to why I was thinking about Grenfell so much. Hi, come on in. And during a week where a activist collective that I was a part of, Trans Healthcare Mutual Aid Organization, were getting dragged by the right-wing press, and just trying to write something that was kind of trying to respond to this moment where I think it's kind of weird. I think quite a lot of my work and also sonically, is trying to kind of forges out of this it's what does it mean to try and argue with the radio or try and argue with the newspapers? And how can you produce something sonically that feels like it might be trying to do that? In ways at times it felt quite lo-fi, but yeah, that's where that work was kind of born out of. We're talking about DIY and embodiment. And in the process of this, go back to the text. There's various things that were happening that have kind of emerged in I'd say my writing, but also my performance around how embodiment is kind of articulated grammatically in the work. And this kind of emerged out of a long period of exploration. There's, how some of the best things happen in performance by accident when you make a mistake and you're wow, something just happened on stage and it was useful. I did this one performance where I had some plastic stuck in my throat, and I spent the whole performance trying to like get the plastic out of my throat and continue reading my poems. And Jennifer Cook, who's like quite a well-known English literature scholar, was like, "What's going on here? What's happening?" And from that moment, I started trying to think about like, how is embodiment written into the oh, sorry, these things are not related. Sorry, I'm looking at my computer screen and it's completely not separate from the slide deck. Thinking about how can the work itself like capture that? And so I'm going to fast forward a little bit. I'm going to come back to Zong and breath. So this is kind of what we were thinking about before. I started writing this. I started myself off on this space of trying to think about like how to create a new kind of grammar or new forms of punctuation, really explicitly, in my work that was space to try and capture and pull out some of this, like, on the one hand, it becomes a moment of articulation and performance of like how to sound something like this. I still don't. I mean, I don't even know what's going on there anymore. Like, I wrote this poem a long time ago, and on the other hand, trying to be, it becomes an interface between the body and the text as well in that moment of performance. So it's kind of like an interesting triangulation when I say that out loud like this, and that's kind of like, yeah, I'm going to come back to sirens, body and faultlines. But it's kind of what's happening. Sorry, don't mind me. Fast backwards in this moment, and rewind. So one of the things that I've been sitting with in my performance practice is using loops and like having like a looper on stage. It kind of, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes I've had moments where I'm like, I'm trying to like step away from this, and other times really leaning into it. Because the joy of using loopers with voice is that your poetry is not necessarily circular, right? And the structure of a loop is obviously sonically circular. And so on the one hand, like creating poems that would try and lean into this space, and on the other, at times just trying to step back and step away from that. And I'll talk about that a bit more in relation to some more recent work. And so this kind of became, we're talking about like the niner and the sequence, and like contemporary poetry's really kind of been interested in the sequence as form. I realize I'm just talking about poetry loads, so apologies. Here we are, poetry time. And the sequence kind of emerges in the middle of the 20th century as this, like, it's a space through which, like the book-length poem, this long-form verse through which you can really explore something over really an extended period of time. And so that's kind of happening with the sequence as well. And then with apparitions, I was really trying to be like, how can I turn this around? How can I shift this? So I started doing these readings, which you can actually kind of see right at the front. It's not going to load now. I'm going to be left on a white screen. Brilliant. But, great. Anyway, I was doing these readings where I would shuffle my poems at the start of a reading. And this is really crashed. Nice. Oh, yeah, here we go. You can kind of see this. I would shuffle my poems, and then I'd like basically like discard them, and they become these props on the stage of like the poems are just these little sheets of red that are scattered around me. This is happening for a really long time, basically, until this book came out, and then I'm reading from a book, and the book's got a spine, right? But I became interested in the ordering and the reordering of the work, what happens with meaning making, what happens with juxtaposition, what happens sonically, and then using the loop as I just did to, basically like do a live, I don't want to just call it a remix, but like a live improvisation of the lines reordered, which is what, I'm going to play it again, because I can do that.
Stars and being and pills. She says had your impositions. 500 truncated years, we impossible siblings,
homes, and circuits. Our shaven flesh and locks dined on. Smears and intonations. Okay. And then this also turned into like an opportunity to really explore this textually. This is a version of Apparitions that was published in a magazine called And Shy, Empress and Shy. And it's from quite early. I think it's before the lines are really heavily edited compared to what they were back then. But we basically created this like shuffleable version of the text where, I can just click this bit. I like picked lines from across the sequence where I was really thinking about how we could how the lines could be reordered in a way that they would still make sense. So there's 9 poems, there's 81 lines, and I think they always appear in the position they were in the poem. So the first line is always the first line. The first line is always the first line, and the last line is always the last line. And it became like, this is really the level I was trying to break it down to, right? So like, how can the text still hold meaning in a way that allows for this kind of like shifting and exchanging and transformation? And it's funny because you can't really do this with a book. And so the sequence, it's like we shuffled it enough, and now the sequence, oh, there you go. That's how the poem looks in the book. And then I think, can you go next? Does that work? Yeah, there we go. So it starts every time we can kind of pull the poem apart and put it back together. And so, I mean, I think if I was being really smart, I would try and make some kind of argument here about non-linearity and refusal of linear time and linear temporalities and how we can do that in writing. But I haven't got to that bit in the talk just yet, so maybe I'll get there. Because I'm going to talk about some other things first. How am I doing for time? We're doing all right. I'm talking a bit, right? We've got like half an hour? Cool, brilliant. Amazing. Captive audience. Okay. And wait, I need to go back because this isn't going to work. Right. Okay, so in this space, I was talking about this hilarious moment in 2012 where I was doing a reading and I was choking in the middle of the reading, trying to cough up some plastic. And in this becomes a long-form kind of engagement, thought, practice, sometimes really just practice, right? Sometimes you're just doing things because you feel animated to do them. They just don't necessarily need like extensive intellectual rationale for why you're doing something, although obviously at art school we're encouraged to do that. And in the midst of this, in terms of thinking about what it means to have to breathe every time there's a forward slash in the poem, to think about what's happening syntactically in that moment, that it's 2 pieces of text or two moments of thinking, 2 different thoughts in juxtaposition with each other, and that the slash operates as a way of breaking apart and breaking those things together. And next to that is thinking about all these questions of politics, and especially anti-racist politics, especially in relation to Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives. And have I got a slide for this? No, I didn't. It's fine. That's good. No, I do. Oh, yeah, let's go to that one. What number is it? 21. Excuse me while I do some of this, because I'm like, this is going to be way nicer than me scrolling. I was based in New Cross down the road for many years. It's probably the place where I most felt at home that I've ever lived in my life. And during that time, we were kind of in study, and I think about study, and study is not just education. It's not just being here. It's a way of learning together. When we're talking about being at these demonstrations, being at occupations in the early 2010s, being at encampments now, right? That these are sites of study where we're learning together about what's happening in the place that we're in. And kind of in this kind of first half, Black Lives Matter kind of really begins in the UK after the murder of Michael Brown and then Eric Garner, both in the autumn of 2014. These were moments of mass mobilization of Black and brown and anti-racist activists in the streets. It's another time where we shut down Oxford Street after a vigil after Eric Garner's death. And so we were thinking about the anti-racist history of the city we're in a time where this wasn't this wasn't easily available to us. Steve McQueen hadn't made a series of documentary feature-length films for the BBC about this. And so it was really like, we have to learn this from the people in our neighborhood and the people around us, and going into archives and thinking about this stuff. One of the things that New Cross is known for is the New Cross fire that happened in March at the end of February in 1981. And it was a moment where 13 black children were killed in an arson attack on a party in a house on New Cross Road. And this moment in 1981 led to the largest mobilization of the Black and Asian community that had happened in the UK at the time. Like 20,000 people marched from New Cross to Fleet Street, and there was a media blackout about it, and it took 5 or 6 weeks before the person who was in charge back then, what was her name? Maggie Thatcher? Something like that. She took like 5 weeks to acknowledge this event had happened. And it was one of many firebombings that had happened to Black and Asian community spaces, such as like the Albany Theatre in Deptford, like these black and radical bookshops. These were spaces and sites of learning and of coming together and of sharing culture, right? And, Metropolitan Police were a different kind of racist back then. And this also, so this was what was happening with thinking about this. And so, I lived on a street, I had to walk past that house. I mean, the house is there, people live there. There's a plaque on the house now. And sit outside Goldsmiths and get my bus to work every day. And I was thinking quite a lot about the undercover police cars that were just driving by every day when I'm sat at the bus stop. And so I just started on the one hand, just making notes of these things. All these notes ended up in this poem or in this book of Sirens, Body and Faultlines. And next to that, I was thinking about, there's questions of so on the one hand, thinking about this question of breathing, not just in this question around blackness, and that became really key in BLM, Eric Garner's last words were, I can't breathe, right? And so breath becomes a political condition in this moment. And one of the, that's Bikini Kill, that's not where we're going to. Let's go back this way. One of the key kind of artists, poets, performers, writers, thinkers, scholars, who was really bringing this into the poetic domain for us in this moment. At least, we were encountering her work in this same moment. Is Nobessa Philip, Nobessa Philip, who produced this incredible poem Zong that was published originally I think it's actually 2006. Ignore my dates are all wrong in this slide deck. That's what happened yesterday. All the dates are wrong. And I had the fortune of reading with Nobessa in Brighton sometime in 2015. And I was thinking about how to, create this kind of sonic space. So I'm going to go that way. I've gone too far. That is a reflection and is thinking through this circularity of sound and of noise and of police presence and securitization of the urban environment of London, and thinking about how the loop is a means of capturing that, of creating these poems that are really they got really loud at some point. That's what I was trying to do, and it kind of became unbearable. I don't really read in that way anymore. But also because it was quite nice at the time using quite rudimentary tech. So I do these readings, sometimes you're is there a PA? And they're like, there's no PA. It's just just a industrial room, We put some stuff on the walls. It's a gallery. And, because we're doing this DIY, there's no money. No one's got any money. And so I'd be doing these readings, and I'd have some little computer speakers that I used to carry around. They were my ex-girlfriend's computer speakers. And so when I put the loop pedal through them, it did sound like a radio. It sounded really tinny, but it created this interesting juxtaposition next to my spoken voice in the space. You can mostly hear me off mic rather than hearing me through a PA, and then there'll be these little repetitions coming out through these tiny speakers, which I kind of think is more interesting in a way. And then, where was Nobessa? I'm going to go back, sorry. There she is. Nobessa's work Zong, which I've got an image of here. I don't know if I'm going to show the video. If you were in my decolonial thesis lecture, which this is kind of going to become in a second, we'd spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes watching Nobessa perform Zong, which you can find clips of on YouTube, and it's really astonishing. So Zong is I've got to talk about the poem because that's really important. Zong is a response, a text that's trying to recover the voices of the 460-something black people who were killed aboard the slave ship Zong in the late 18th century, in the 1780s. There was a case where this ship, the Zong, was caught on the high sea with no wind. The captains of the ship decided that they could throw the enslaved black people overboard and claim them on insurance as loss of cargo, right, during transatlantic slavery, right? And this was a really key legal case at the time, it set a really key legal precedent. And so Nobessa, really extensively went through this archive, was thinking about what it means to try and recover those voices, the names of the people who were lost, to create space for them to breathe, very literally in the text. She talks about how the lines all have these kind of gaps above them on the page, because she's like, the language literally needs a space to breathe on the page, right? The names need a space to breathe. And this, Zong is a performance work that Nobessa continues to perform, and it's cyclical. It's like she'll pick the book up, enter the sequence from wherever she left it. She'll read the poems, she'll repeat them. The whole work begins to turn this way, right? Which way is that? Let's go that way. And in relation to thinking about the cycles, thinking about the currents across the Atlantic, across the Black Atlantic, which you can see here. This is a video of Nobessa performing in Miami, I believe, of this work. So I think I bring in Nobessa because I'm this reading we did together in Brighton really fundamentally changed my life. And in thinking about, again, what poetry can do in relation to the historical lineages that we're trying to deal with in relation to colonialism, slavery, plantation economies, in relation, and thinking about the Caribbean and the Americas, thinking about dispossession, thinking about extraction on this kind of global scale, thinking about these histories of what we think of as racial capitalism, which is the idea that capitalism racism exists through capitalism, and that they're co-constituted of each other historically over 500 to 600 years, where 1492, which is when that other guy, Christopher Columbus, that's the one, supposedly stumbled across a continent that people were already living on, and he ended up leading, him and the various armies who followed him, various nations who followed him, committed a genocide of the indigenous people who were living in the Americas following that. And so we're in this kind of what we're in Christine Sharp refers to as the wake, thinking about the legacies of transatlantic slavery, plantation economies, etc. And so there's a reveal of okay, so what can the work do? How we can shift through these things? Now, I was going to talk a little bit about sirens, body, and faultlines, but I'm not, because and this is a quotation from an essay Nobessa wrote, which is actually quite recent. I say recent, I mean in the 2020s. Thinking about breath, she's actually responding to this essay from Nathaniel Mijke, who's also another key poet, in relation to breathing, and thinking about these questions of she's also even questioning what it means to have an epigenetics of slavery, and thinking about breath in relation to this. And how breathing for another could be an act of radical hospitality within present historical systems of power that attempt to eradicate and erase the individual and those who are perceived as marginal, deficient, less than, and different. So what could it mean to be trying to breathe for another? I think I would say I've been more sitting with this idea than anything, than having anything more to say. And so between this, I was started talking about the noise, started talking about the spaces. I was thinking quite a lot about this space, actually, in prepping for today. This is the title page of what was... So this book came out a while ago in 2018, but all the work within it was published in various zines that we made over like a 4-year period. And it became... Zines is thinking about DIY production, the aesthetics of that, the visual aesthetics, photocopies, even using really bad printers, stealing access, printing stuff on my work printer, having crappy day jobs and using your work printers as the means of reproduction, the means of production for what you're creating. But in practice, I was just like, I used to get the bus, so I get on the bus at Deptford, I get on the 172, go up the Old Kent Road every day, and we'd also be watching these worlds that we were kind of in being demolished, right? Especially with the gentrification of the Aylesbury and what is called Elephant Park, right, around here. And I say that because it's like, this is actually quite a key site in the movement, in like the squat movement and with social centres. Like the other times I've read around here have been in social centres. There was an occupation at Aylesbury that was brutally evicted. One day I was on the bus, and this is when I wrote this poem, right? And I was thinking about collages as these moments of like how to capture something about the physical built environment. Think about these questions of like how to re-piece together, reconstitute this space that we're in, how to capture something on the page that's also sonic, and in a way that like these poems are like really kind of like sparse in a way. They're quite they're really also kind of dense simultaneously. It's like minimal but also dense. And this is why these guys were here. This is like my soundtrack, right? So if you basically if you go to London Bridge Station and you look at the Shard and you listen to Sonic Youth's Bad Mood Rising, that's the aesthetic environment that I'm trying to constitute in these poems, or reconstitute on the page. Obviously, you can't actually do that. That's the joy of, and thinking about it in relation to like post-punk as about noise, distortion, defiance, feedback, this constant environment of like economic transformation and destruction, and knowing that if you're making life and making worlds within spaces that are marginalized or are poor or are occupied in the sense of we're claiming something that's out of use. We're setting up a social center. There was a social center that was set up on the other side of the roundabout in what is now a pub. I didn't check what the pub is called anymore. But these were spaces where we were trying to come together and organize and think about our lives and learn about the world, What does it mean to learn from that context? Okay, so that's me talking about sirens, body and faultlines. I'm going to share a little... Should I do this? I've got loads of time. I'll show a tiny clip. I'm going to play a tiny clip of a reading, which is actually from every time there's like a fascist insurgency, and I have to do a reading. I find myself pulling from this book again, and this was a reading I actually did last December in Brussels.
The siren of the body broadcast contented from its fault line in the norm dogmatic, emits its private sphere and clammed in stoppage shoops, affirmed, articulated, broadcast evenings of relations suffered, assured universal citizen emits its private sphere and clammed in stoppage shoops, speech to affirmed, articulated, broadcast evenings of relations suffered, assured universal citizen emits its private sphere and clammed in stoppage shoops, speech to affirmed, articulated, broadcast evenings of relations suffered, ideal sourced on the precarity of the present day, waged, authorized, affirmed, sleep thought materials plants in the future's times, ideal sourced on the precarity of the present day, waged, authorized, affirmed, sleep
ideal sourced on the precarity of make capital gains, ideal sourced on in the survival of winter. Approach choke New Crossroads diagnostic 151.2 micrograms per meter cube PM10 filth pack occupational assess and redund and repetitive self-brand 3 sirens Altken unmarked 939 0.6% growth in the spring ideal who is objects and subjects of recovery historicalize the city of Westminster, kernel of dispossession, ideal source. In Fever Dream, landscape conceptual, beauty of the gentry, visions, cities, lights, skyscraping flesh we inhabited in former decades, continental drifts, sails, claim bodies and souls here in the present. Hydration seeds, flesh, electric. The passage of future, or cut out the stars. Muscles, wire, horizontal, emit vague, dull, and desolation. The basis of utterance, while the muscle tissue diverges. Eluded circulations, syncopated as the mouth eluded circulations, embodiment and the demands of the day. Into futures, throat clips and glitches, clarity of the centigrade, wage, authorized. Our presence in the city, historical odds, the most racist electric, perimeters of work and restrictures education, les frontières quotidiennes, distant futures or extractions, rent day and terror, externalized English fear, just aura. Deptford High Street, 10:22 a.m. Multi-agency, unmarked galaxy, SE59XER, flanked by 3 officers. Left onto New Cross Road, returns in the opposite direction, turns left onto Florence Road, the material and immaterial border. Anxieties our keep us sun deficient, marking on held fabrics, sweetness, break tense into knowing, out of where, under schooling nights, collapse, anxiety into active form, hunger into improvisation. That fear bred by law and capital newsprint, phrase nerve only in our cellulus, taken daily to pave, ages downward, spectral to the bullet for any black person, state-sanctioned and delivered as just. Sphere of such notions, dispossessing the rational with the cuff threat to our friends. Of officer cognitions, that this death does not exist in our borders, elevations of possible violence within the solidarity and not the baton and cell. That the mass arrest here is not for profiles, racialized with the white cop, minority against. Black and brown youth, our brave, inflect resounds fierce, feminine, that the guilty particular resounds determinate negations of cognitive blood of the British state since 2001, 1981, 1757, 1562, tens our separations by culture, by the knife at skin. What momentarily we crashed, still Regent and Oxford streets, Brooklyn Bridge, FDR Drive, Route 508, the flaming economy of Ferguson. As our don't shoot and bodies break the Whitehall fear charge of riot bands. December 2014. I'm just looking at my score. I've got noise, urban space. Oh yeah, I was thinking about this relationship between urbanity, the material, the urban space is this material context of exchange relations, but also like of abstractions, of separation, of division, of isolation, and then simultaneously a space of social intermixing and coming together, right? And that this is all of the stakes of what we're trying to explore, or I'm trying to explore in the sonic architecture of the work. Oh yeah, that's what I did. Okay, cool. I figured out what I did. So, how am I doing for time? Good? 20 minutes. I can go a bit longer than 20, but I'll try and do 20. Okay, cool. Great. I'm just going to show you more stuff. I think that's what will happen. So, next to this, I'm going to try and seek into talking about some more recent things, and kind of some concerns that come out of this. Oh yeah, this is the wrong screen. Right. Let's get to the right screen. This is the right screen. Oh, where's the numbers? The numbers over there. This is the point where it seeks into the lecture on decolonialist thesis. Some of the more, I'm going to share a couple of excerpts of documentation and talk a little bit about two kind of more recent, I could just call them projects. I mean, performance works, texts, poems, kind of thinking about sound and the multi-channel and all these things. But to seek into this is kind of a moment to think about what I think various scholars, I've pulled two quotes from Rolando Vaquez, but various scholars and artists, organizers, curators, thinkers, have been thinking through the last kind of 20, 15, 10 years, really about trying to challenge this, like, the Western paradigm of aesthetics and of us, not just of aesthetic sensibility, but aesthetics in relation to like how we understand, interpret the world, challenging both, like, on the one hand, questions around representation, and in the visual space, thinking about the dichotomy of the subject and the object and how that's constituted, all the kind of way, I kind of want to say back to Kant, but we're not going to give him all the credit, even though we also enjoy dumping him in the water. And in this space is also the sense that, and this is kind of going back to what I was saying before when we're talking about Nobesser and thinking about the legacies of racial capitalism, that there's no modernity without coloniality. And to say that the modern period that we think of, especially both, not just in terms of thinking about modernism in the 20th century, we're thinking also about the invention of modernity through this paradigm of the legacies of all the stuff I was just talking about. I mean, if this was my lecture, that we'd have the map of the transatlantic slave trade, and then we try and talk about how the numbers on the map of the number of enslaved black people who were deported from Africa into the Americas and the Caribbean doesn't really capture anything about the lives and the worlds and the people and the cultures that were stolen, plundered, erased. And so in all of this, there's a question of like, how do we produce something that is refusing the logics and the ordering of sense that modern aesthetics has offered us? And like, it's interesting because I think in the space of poetics, like, we get we've been doing similar thinking basically since the kind of French Romantic period, kind of like Rimbaud is kind of like key in this moment, right? If we read him seriously, which is what Sean Bonney was encouraging us to do. And in that, in the
the French Revolution also kind of functions as this moment of like, the ideas of liberty, equality, and equality are created in France and then met very quickly by the uprising in Haiti in the beginning of the 19th century, which is brutally repressed by France. You know, when the Haitians who've been enslaved for a few hundred years are like, hey, liberty, equality, equality, that sounds great. We're going to do that, and that involves us getting rid of you guys. And why am I talking about this? And next to this is the sense of, okay, so in all of, it's like, how do we use these tools, these ideals of modernism, kind of against, to reveal the contradictions of its principles and to reactivate them to create social transformation in a way that's meaningful. And the sensorial is really key. So this is just, I would usually read this out loud. Thinking about declaring aesthesis as different from modern aesthetics. So aesthetics is for us the order of regulation of the senses and of the arts under modernity, whereas decolonial aesthesis we speak of as the plurality of sensorial experiences and expressions that are in excess of the modern order of aesthetics, which is to say that the modern order of aesthetics has also erased like ways of being in the world, ways of relation to the world, ways of relation to the land that you're on, to the water space that we're in, in terms of cultural belonging as well. And I think this raises some interesting questions for those of us who are in the diaspora. Like I'm second generation like Bengali, right? I was born here I was born in England. Yeah, there you go. Truth. And next to that is thinking about the forms of dispossession that we experience both like historically, but then also in this cultural space here, you know. What does the pedagogy of music and poetry and sound art that we're given, that we're taught, you know, especially think about what kind of poetry we're taught in schools, what does that offer about to the experience of us who are members of a diaspora, who are black or brown, or who are mixed or whatever, and thinking about how to intervene in the kinds of logics and the orderings of this. And this is also like, you know, I think quite a lot about, I sit a lot with like having a complex relationship to my mother tongue that I'm like technically illiterate in, but also kind of fluent in, but also kind of can't speak. It's like a weird complexity of like knowledge and a loss of knowledge because of the dynamics of multicultural assimilation, right? And why is that important? That's important because when I've been talking about the 2010s, this is in this moment of politicization for us all. This is also the moment where the multicultural grammar of neoliberal Britain is like revealed. You know, you're raised in this culture that says, yeah, we can be different and it can be great. We can all live side by side. It is revealed as being fiction, right? And there are various points in histories where various points in time where that's revealed to us. But it's revealed to us in that space, in that moment in the mid-2010s. And that's the moment where it politicizes us. And it becomes, how does it shift and influence the work that we're doing? So, where am I? Let's go up here. Let's go back. I'm going to talk about, let's see if these slides load. Two kind of, am I going to talk about them? I'm going to show you some documentation about two kind of projects that are unfolding that I'm thinking through. One is a body of work called aquasomatics, which is that word but with in the plural, and it's kind of been constituted through. I've been working on these poems for like these performances for like the last 5 years. And thinking about this relationship of like, what does it mean to write through histories of water and water's embodiment, including thinking about histories of extraction as pertaining to water and also returning to land, and thinking about questions around migration and labor and these like almost quite classically Marxist concerns that have been feeding my work. I'm going to play a video, so it'll be nice. And in the this has another layer of something to explain. So I'm going to play a clip of a performance from pretty much this time last year. I should talk about sound. We're at sound arts. So with acrosmatics, I've been thinking quite a lot expansively about, in particular, like how to think about stereo, which should come up will come up in a minute because I'm going to read something as well live. But in the process, I got paired with a musician, composer, Ailey Ormston, who's based in Glasgow. Ailey basically creates their own instruments, and we produced this kind of performance together for acrosmatics, where we were thinking a lot about how to take instruments in response to the work, in response to the words on the page. Sorry, bear with me. I need to pause for a second. And Ailey was like making these instruments based on organic sounds that they'd record and sample and resample. So that's what you will hear. I'm gonna show a video of a poem called "The Breathers," which is thinking about what's the word? What is the word? I forgot my language. Thinking about when bodies of water run out of oxygen, basically, and thinking about how this relates to ecological cycles, thinking about indigenous knowledge from the Americas and how the kind of ecological knowledge that might enable the rewilding sort of rivers and river ecologies. And so I'm based in Scotland, and one of the classic things in Scotland is thinking about how there's no salmon left in the wild. And so this text was kind of also written to try and be in dialogue with that, or this work was written to be in dialogue with that. Okay, so I'm going to press play.
The Breathers. Lose the light under algal loom. Cut the oxygen to less than 4.6 milligrams per litre. Blue-green negations on the substance of breath cast dead zones. Fill to two aphotic to bed d compose of breath cast dead zones are sit fill to two d aphotic to bed d composition hose of breath, lightless, burning acidity, pelagic sensitivities of fauna and the burrowing deep, mussels, worms by valves degrading, interfaced, dominated by microbes. Heavier water deoxygenated up, welling under the charge of winds with the retching climate, stratifying the heat between surface water and the deep. In the entanglement of all particles, phosphate sunk, methane gassing off, late summer flares, nitrogens, runs off capitals toxicity from which grows our food. Toxic in mono-agricultural phosphates to maximize a yield soil, as if we meet the breath of our lives already out. Mortality of mass at surface, if you need an economy of scale, biomass equivalent to a small nation, cascade and reach the dead. Indian nation, Pacific Northwest, Turtle Island. Stewards to river, land, oceanic, the sacred in the cellular. Salmon people in the reciprocity of care. River, suck-eye, blueback, a keystone. Between fish and human, gifted, born from the creator, born upon centuries, rivers ancestral. For thousands of years, cooked on a cedar. To hold the encroaching tides of ocean and settler colonialism, its political economies of suffocation. Clear-cut commerce, logging at the watershed, 1920 to 23. It unravels the river. Elders speak of the drying up of fishing. Salmon diminish their presence at ceremonies. Coastal miles and halves, littered of life. Acid burns razor clams as the millennium turns. Breathers, pescatarius, against the logic that cuts difference from a relation to land. For who the water aspires, active insubordination, holds the treaties against corporate advance. If the ocean itself gasps to finality, Nobessa speaks of each gap and gasp carrying the potential of the universe. And if you cannot carry back your body, but in the reciprocity of care, say the Gulf of Mexico dies each summer. To hold and if you cannot carry back your body, say the Baltic spores its own mortalities, oceanic. Salmon people in the reciprocity of care, say the rising sea temperatures boost the algal blooms. To hold and if you cannot carry back your body, say the suffocation of water is environmental racism. Tears off and in the water to recover a breathing seascapes. Maranzalaria shuttle organic matter into depths, oxygenating, binding phosphorus. Oceanic, and if you cannot carry back your body, salmon people in the reciprocity of care. Say river, the pathway of restoration is vastly different from degradation. Oceanic, for small worms to recover ecologies. Say the rising sea temperatures boost the algal blooms. Rebuilding the river for spawn and salmon fry. Its political economies river, of suffocation. A keystone.
To hold and if you cannot carry back your body.
Colonialism. Its political economies of suffocation. To hold and if you cannot carry back your body. I'm going to read another poem from this body of work. It's called Disintegrations. At the limit, continents in motion, rigors sparred to a neck scalar, volume
of life dynamic held as a godhead. Let hair, mother, rivers becoming source for most life. Fricked. Ions hold as liminal these bodies, gravitating from the base, gathers pressure like a spine, dragged weight, and absolute beauty. So little light penetrates our silence, cut by pause, shared ablation, urgent hunger. Face, carbon flux, turbulent in the duality, in the condition, particles becoming weather, the radiation scattered out of the beam, back scattered, reflect, whipping jewels that penetrates. Gathers pressure like a spine to carry life.
Corners holding
held
down the
as a
planetary. Supra glacial touched by your
rivers
smoking
becoming
piston, by
for
our
most
silence. Your drive
by pause. Gathers pressure like a spine, dragged weight, and absolute beauty. Funds a denial. Little
a discourse
light
of
penetrates
plunder and den.
aisle, plunder, disintegration, volume,
Fixator
of life dynamic held
terrestrial.
as a godhead.
Grow with it.
Let
Biomassa.
mother, rivers becoming source for most life.
Pass blizzards as the ground resettles.
Volume of life dynamic
And in the trial,
saline holding the dream of flood, mammalian breaching paths, settlements, cater wall, life, volume of life dynamic held as a godhead. Let so hair, mother,
little
rivers, light
becoming
penetrate source
stress
for most life.
your drive gravities.
Dance volume of life. So little light penetrates
Stress your drive gravities.
dance
Enough stress on in response dance enough stress from crevices response in the flesh melts driven flows in from the base dynamic beautiful services ablating gradually you feel coming melts driven through enough flows in from the base beautiful services ablating gradually you feel coming melts driven through enough flows in from the base beautiful services ablating gradually Creature, be like spirit, ray. Sing your head from the aliquot. Vestiges sparse. Tender daylight. This is where we're at. Cool. The joy of this not being a performance, I'm like... The joy of this not being a performance, being like, oh, I messed that up. It's fine, never mind. And what was I going to say? I was going to say, what are my notes? This work's quite, like, research heavy. The breathers is about hypoxia, I was talking about a little bit already. Disintegrations is really thinking about glacial melting. This is like, when I say research heavy, I'm like deep in science geeking, thinking about the kind of dynamics behind what's happening and thinking about how the text can, and the performance of the work can reflect or like actively embody that. Which is kind of what's happening here. But also it's, I guess, like, I think it says something about my attention to the materials that I'm working with, that they always come out super queer, and there's like a weird erotics that emerges in the work as well. And so kind of in this space of like trying to think about other ways of sensing the world, the space that where has this gone? Oh yeah, my mouse is here. Other ways of sensing the world, of thinking about connection to land, presence, movement, ancestral presence. There's this thing that Dion Brand talks about, Dion Brand's a poet and a scholar, and she talks about how every work has, the work always has this line or an opening from one text, one poem to the next text. There's a line in a novel or a line in an essay that opens its way to the next thing. And so in the process of kind of working on aquasomatics over this, I have at least one, I feel like there's one more thing I need to write, and then maybe there'll be a whole other thing, and who knows. I kind of stumbled into, that's what we just looked at. I read Disintegrations, that happened. I mean, this whole work's also kind of emerged out of like my way of life, of like thinking about spending loads of time at like being with the sea and the ocean and the birds, and listening and thinking about how different elements of knowledge and meaning emerge just through the presence of listening, of the wind when it becomes something that's more than the wind, but it becomes a sense of presence, a sense of hearing. And in the process of this, I kind of started producing this performance work called Epistolary on Carceral Islands, listening and looking, right? I started thinking about, this is the Bass Rock, which is about 50 miles off the coast from Edinburgh, which is where I live. And I started speculating on if this was the first use of a prison on an island as a mode of incarceration. In the like tourist narrations of this island, which is a gannet colony, they talk about how it's Scotland's Alcatraz, which is hilarious because this has existed for like 600 years longer than Alcatraz. So it was like, that's funny, at least as a space that was used as a carceral technology. And in the spirit of like, what might it mean to reinterpret the spaces that we're in, I've kind of been in dialogues, and I mean, amongst many other scholars, artists, writers, historians, thinkers, especially in Scotland, thinking about Scotland's legacies of colonialism, slavery included. And
I started speculating on this, like thinking about the like Scotland's relationship to the technologies of imprisonment. Turned out that the first panopticon was built in Edinburgh. I was looking at it this morning on the train. There's the trace of it that remains kind of in the middle of the city. And you know, when you start digging, when you begin to dig, you find some more things down there. So I produced this like multi-channel performance work, and I was thinking about ancestral memory, ancestral stories from my own personal family history as well. And so the work is kind of written as this series of letters that are addressing ancestors and transcestors who are incarcerated, including two of my great uncles who were imprisoned by the British in the 1930s for anti-colonial revolt in what is now in Bangladesh. They were involved in the uprising in Chittagong in the early 1930s. And this moment was, this uprising, I'm not going to talk about it in huge length, it was a moment where they basically restaged the Easter Rising in Dublin, but in Bangladesh. That was their model of anti-colonial revolt. They staged it on Easter weekend in 1930, and they were thinking about forms of kind of a violent resistance in relation to like the Satika non-violent movement in India that was actually kind of at a lull. It was in like the movement led by Gandhi that was at a lull at that point. And some of the new historiographies of this revolt, I mean, this whole complexity around like how the Hindu right is trying to appropriate them as well. But the more recent historiographies argue that this uprising was actually really key for the kind of the unfurling of the colonial grip on India. And so I'm just going to show you a bit of I'm going to show you the work as a series of letters. So I've made 2.5 performances of it so far. The second one was in Galway, and this is from the first one that was in Edinburgh. No one's ever seen this, so I hope nobody's watching online. And yeah, it's captioned. You'll be able to see the captions. I think when I was watching it, the multi-channel sound comes out quite well. So this was done in a 3-channel setup. The space that we're in is actually in the University of Edinburgh. The whole text has this whole section about how the University of Edinburgh was built immediately before the kind of key architects of Enlightenment in Scotland built the Bridewell prison that was like this prison for women and kids, basically, in the city. And they have this amazing panoptical conference room that they are obsessed with. So we staged the performance there, obviously. And yeah, it's subtitled. You can also see the screen here with the subtitles. Okay, I'm going to play. I think this will be about 10 minutes, and I'm going to stop talking. Is that okay? Yeah? Yeah? This is. How are we for time? Okay, we'll have some time. Okay.
Mamu, Mamu, amid the cut of the world and the sun, I seek you to steal persistence. In the intensification of backlash, we are still in the market for strategies of staying alive. To believe in hope between the rivets of fascism and liberalism, both claiming victimhood. You write of a university forged from hunger against that constructed hell, a do-or-die condition. Reading books smuggled and copied longhand, Satyendranath Sanyal's Bandi Jinam and Das Kapital. Hunger runs blood slow. They do not know how your skin dreams. To forge and embody the crisis collective, embody revolution, Lahori prisoners already experience the body as a locus to be heard. To build a public empathy, collected in Calcutta squares, trigger and harness grief and rage, disquiet and despair. After a 1-month ultimatum for grievances, the third hunger strike on Andaman, 12th of May 1933, of 55 prisoners and 35 withdrawing their labour, demands light in cells after 10 p.m, the right to petition central and local governments, an extensive and varied diet including a choice of vegetables, improved latrines and toiletries. For regular newspapers, reading material, the prison in hunger be transformed against itself, a locus of and for study. You petition with the separation of grief, separability, appeal to order with emotion as the site of humanity. Then the screaming began. Spine's burning deprivation elicit, writing nerves in the accrual. You speak this back to British journalists. You resisting the force feed. Catching the tube with your tongue, it in your throat. Succeeding, then giving in to the cool gush of liquid. And hearing Mahavir Singh screaming his last. You shouted, Inquilab Zindabad. And after Mohit Mitra and Man Krishna Das, you cried, Inquilab Zindabad.
Chief Commissioner sent Jail Superintendent to negotiate with us. The Jail Superintendent told us that Chief Commissioner would fulfill all our demands. He will give us privileges we never had dreamt. We told him that no individual could take a decision, therefore collect us at one place. Thereafter we were brought on stretchers at one place with a warning to take a decision immediately. We decided to terminate the hunger strike from that very day.
Our 3 colleagues died in that 46 days hunger
The food
strike.
that was given to us was the worst.
After
There
the
was no
hunger
light,
strike,
no newspaper,
so
no
much
permission for
facilities
moving
were
outside,
provided to
etc.
us.
We requested many
A
times to
library was
improve the
established
quality of
there.
food and to provide light for
We
us,
started
but
playing.
no action was taken.
Kitchen
Then
came
we
under our
decided to
control.
achieve facilities through hunger strike.
All types
After
of
that hunger
political
strike, we got
prisoners were
facilities.
treated in the
We got
same
permission
way
to arrange
now.
books from outside.
All
The light was
political
given and we
prisoners
were
each
permitted
say
to
now.
organise classes.
Chief
where we
Commissioner
read
gave us
I
permission to
enjoyed
play
political
football in the
classes
ground.
there.
We
I
established a
read communist
library.
literature.
Classes were started in the
Our
jail for the
teachers
purpose of teaching
Shiv
political
Verma,
ideas.
Dr.
Dr. Narayan Roy was
Roy,
our teacher.
Jaideo Kapoor.
Gradually, we started becoming communist.
The effect of the hunger strike was that it demoralised the prison authorities. They realised they cannot get away with any rough treatment of us. They were on the defensive and they did not even come to interfere as to what we were doing as long as we were within prison walls. That period to me was the best part of my life, when we built up to our own surprise very successfully that lifestyle of intense cultural, educational activities.
I'm going to pause there so I don't talk for like 2 hours. So is that all right, Annie? Should we pause? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you can keep that one if you want.
Thanks.
That was incredible. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
We could have gone on for longer, but yeah, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So yeah, would anyone like to start us off? Yeah.
Going to move over. Also, I feel like I have that thing where I just talk and I don't talk about a bunch of things that I mean to talk about. So feel free to quiz me about things that I haven't talked about that you're interested in.
Thank you for the last reading you did, where
thanks.
you were using the Lupa extensively. And I'm really interested in your use of Lupa with poetry, and I wondered if it's perhaps a way of literally multiplying your voice to as a minority to actually make your voice bigger, if there's anything in that. And then at other points, I've got older ears, so I was struggling to hear some of what was being said because of all the layering going on. And I wondered if that you're perhaps using that as some way of hiding some of the things that you want to say, but you don't necessarily want everybody to understand. You want to perhaps keep something for yourself? I don't know. There was just two thoughts.
Opacity. Yeah. I'd say, like, thinking about, so there was a clip that I was showing the collage images. I think in those particular poems, I was thinking quite a lot about how I wanted to, it's like, how do you perform what's basically background text? And thinking about how to use language to create something that's sonic, that doesn't have to be heard, like the language doesn't have to be heard. So I don't know if that's where some of the and it's like, because I became quite interested in like the power of the whisper when you're talking out loud on a microphone. And then one of the pieces from acrosomatics, I started doing this multi-channel back, like using the stereo, but just having it as the back and the front, right? I mean, you could do this in a black box 4-channel setup quite easily. But and just having all this kind of whispering from the back of the room, and I was using a lot of like kind of just like essayistic text, stuff that's quite dry, stuff that you don't really need to hear, but to have it literally in the physical space of the sonic space of the room. And think about what that actually does to your body when you can like hear this whispering from behind you. That was for a piece that's called Rubus, or Between the Fragments of the Rubus and the Rose. That is kind of produced in collaboration with Rahana Zaman, who's an artist filmmaker, and so we were kind of screening these films at the same time, and with like Rahana had these like weird abstract clips from her work. And yeah, in terms of the loops and multiplicity, I think quite a lot about this question. I was talking about the police sirens, but on the flip side of that, around that same time, I just remember doing this reading one time where there was a Surround Harmondsworth demo outside Harmondsworth Detention Centre, and there was a series of demos outside Yarl's Wood at this period. And we're thinking a lot about like, I remember being like, I have to go give a poetry reading, so I can't go to this demonstration. So how can I bring that space into the reading? And then using this like, just like literally kind of almost like live streaming video of people chanting into the space of the recording. Into the space of the reading through the loop, and then having this kind of chant on a loop. And then obviously like when you've got a crowd of people chanting on a recording and you're reading a poem, it's just like your voice kind of just blends into that. So yeah, thinking about multiplicity, and in this clip I just shared at the end also, like this work is like, I was talking about research intensive stuff, but this is all like oral history archived of people talking about being in the Andamans, which was this prison 10,000, so it's like 1,000 miles off the coast of India. That's where my great uncles were deported to in the 30s. And so yeah, trying to use this like multiplicity of voices, also thinking about who's in the room with me. There's some great poets and anti-colonial scholars who are my and friends who are just like my voices in this as well. I'm not going to name them. And think about this, like, what does it mean to revoice the archive as well in a way that is, and when I say it's a performance, I hope nobody's watching. It's like, there are always copyright questions around these things. But it's like, I'm giving a friend, my grandfather, my great uncle's voice, sorry. What does it mean to try and bring that into the room with me in Edinburgh or in wherever I'm performing this work? So there's all these senses of like, using both the loop but also the pre-recorded as a way that's also polyvocal. Too much chemistry on the brain, but is simultaneously like allowing a space for that multiplicity to sound. And yeah, I guess I'm not precious about everything being audible all the time. Although I could talk quite a lot about captioning and using captions live for performances, and like why we started doing this and what it does. And especially with the thing I performed, it was like, okay, so how can we use the if I didn't mess it up, the caption and the stereo should match, right? And that's like how these layers also of meaning can be presented in different ways.
Thank you. That's great.
Thanks for the question.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you have any specific approaches or methods to poetry that you found to be most effective in challenging racist ideologies in particular, and provoking compassion and understanding, especially in certain demographics you might be targeting?
Thanks for the question. I think there's something about like who is this. This is like it's like a circulation question more than a creation one. So like, who is the work that you're making in dialogue with? Who's your audience? You know, is it the people around you? Is it your fellow students? Is it a context in like an art gallery space, right? And that's the premise of like, so when I say like, who's the audience? The audience is also like an abstraction or something that's imagined, right? It's an imagined community. This is what Benedict Anderson writes about. And so, or it's a community you literally build, right? Or it's contextual to the institution that you're in, or the context that you're in, the city that you're in, the place that you're in. And so I say that because it becomes about like, what can you give, what can you offer to that space? And I think that's part of the like, what is that, if you can think about that, then that becomes the like, what are the possibilities of your creative intervention to shift either, I don't want to just say attitudes, because, we think about ethics as in terms of like the things that we do in our lives and the reasons why and the way that we do those things. So that's really what I'm like trying to shift. It's not even sometimes, like politics isn't even the right word, I don't think, for it. Because, that's like at this everyday level. That's about how we treat each other, how we look out for each other or how we don't look out for each other. And trying to challenge these like social divisions that get encoded in that level. And so I think there's something about, and so next to that is like, I might be talking about communication, and it might sound like direct communication is the best way to do that, but as somebody who just makes like weird experimental sound, sometimes indirect experimentation is the way to shift those ingrained patterns and can help reveal things that get submerged into the norm and into the everyday that are the way those violences get reproduced, right? I think with with language, it's like even the way we talk about people can reproduce those things, I get really annoyed with the language of migrants, right? Like even though migrants as a word is already a kind of like attempt to politically to have something that's more progressive than the language of illegal aliens, right? Which guys like that guy who's in charge in the States, I've forgotten his name, 45th, right? 47. He's like, even migrants has this function that feels dehumanizing the way that it's used here in the language, right? So how do we talk about people? How do we talk about our friends, and that is part of the political grammar of poetry can help to reveal that. And I don't think it's just in the words, it's also in how we do things and how we organize and how we make readings, how we share our work together, how we bring each other to, how we come together in space. I feel like in another hour of this, if I had to do hour 3, I would maybe talk about curating, but you don't have to hear that today. Because sometimes, it's actually become something else about, like curatorial practice is quite useful for thinking about how we come together. Not necessarily like capital C curatorial practice, but like organizing practice. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So the study of translation of poetry and prose is obviously quite a divisive topic at times, and with your particular style of writing, with this kind of super grammatical structure with a lot of emphasis on certain sibilances and certain sharp intakes within the spaces between words, etc., this presumably would add another kind of layer of difficulty and nuance in the potential translation process of pieces. Do you have any kind of views on translating poetry and prose outside of its native language, both in general and how it applies to your practice?
Thanks for the question. I'm not a translator, so which I guess I would say that means I probably don't have any strong views on translation personally. My work's been translated a lot, both my poetry but also my critical writing. But usually when the poetry's been translated, it's because there's an interest in the work, presumably in relation to what's happening grammatically as well. My language skills are questionable. I'm neurodiverse. My language skills in general, she says at the end of her talk on language. Sorry, just undermining myself. But I can speak a lot. I can speak a number of languages a tiny bit, not very well. But none well enough to be like, oh, I mean, when I try and read poetry bilingually in French, I kind of have some idea of what's going on. But that's kind of it. I'd say. So I really have to trust the people that I'm working with, that they want to try and mirror the grammatical structure or to reflect it, maybe more than mirror it in the language that they're working in. And I mean, I think with the kind of European Romantic languages, it's like, you know, I often, if I'm reading something and if I'm trying to read something in French, I look at the English translation, I'm like, why have they done it in that order? You could do it in the other order. It'd be much more interesting. And but that's also partly where it comes out for me as well, right? Where I'm like, my brain will start being like, how do I rearrange all the words on the page in a way that sounds like musically, that the sound of the language is more interesting than the ordering of the meaning. At least that's a thought and a process thought that I have sometimes when I'm writing. Not all the time, but like, because I really want to be like, language has its own music, and that's what I want to hear. That's what I want to be I'm interested in when I'm hearing. And the sense can be secondary or tertiary almost sometimes. Not that I think my work obviously is thinking about sense quite a lot, but like it doesn't always have to be. I guess sometimes it's more boring when you're just getting the meaning and you're not being given anything to listen to.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Time for maybe one more question. Oh, perfect. Last one.
Hello.
Hi.
Something I've been thinking about very recently, is the trans feminine voice and as trans femme noise, and feminine noise more generally, noise rather than signal, like lo-fi rather than hi-fi, how it's kind of unwanted or can be unwanted, and how other voices might try and push that voice out of the space. So yeah, just if you have any responses to that, like the voice specifically.
Oh my God, I feel like I have a million things and my brain's trying to say them all at once. So, I think there's something about, I guess I wonder sometimes about how, especially with thinking about like, not just trans femme voices, but also like trans voices in general, like that there's like a whole other layer of like gender essentialism that is encoded through, I mean, it is in terms of like how voices are read, right? But even in terms of like how we as trans and non-binary artists or writers or whoever, poets, musicians, like are working with the voice and like, or caught with the voice, and like that's been so nicely like split up and blown up over like the last 10 years. And in terms of lo-fi, in terms of noise and lo-fi, I think there's something powerful in terms of defamiliarization that I think we can kind of work with. I spent actually like, one of the things that I try and talk about sometimes with using loops and pre-recorded elements is to try and like abstract my voice from my body. And I guess at the beginning I was trying to do this in a sense of being like, can the work just exist as voice, as sound? And then really being confronted with the question in performance that the answer is no, and the being present, like something else happens in the performance through presence. And so that's kind of like part of the thing that I was kind of caught in, I'd say. And then, I don't know. I've trailed off, but yeah, I want to know your thoughts. You've probably got more thoughts than I have.
We can talk about it later.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so we will have to wrap up there for now. This is just part one of this evening. So before we thank Nat again for an amazing lecture, a reminder that we'll meet back here at 6, and we'll have Azad Ashim Sharma from the 87 Press introducing Nat Raha, Nisha Ramayya, who will be reading poems and in discussion with Azad And then we'll all go for a drink in the dark room bar from 7:30. So hopefully see you all there. A reminder that the panel is in here, at 6 p.m. And a reminder that next week, no lecture here. See you at Dilston Grove next week. Thank you so much, Ross.